But I just want to tell her in front of millions of people all over the country that I love her very much.
Imagine spending more than 50 years of your life with someone and still refusing to let them go, even after the relationship changes forever. Most Hollywood love stories end with lawyers, headlines, and bitter interviews. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman chose a different path. They separated years ago, yet they still talk almost every day, still celebrate family milestones together, and still speak about one another with a warmth that never completely disappeared. At 81, Danny DeVito has finally opened up about the woman who shaped nearly every chapter of his life. And the story is far more complicated than a simple love story. The woman who saw something nobody else did. Long before Danny DeVito became a household name, he was simply another struggling actor trying to make a living in New York City. There were thousands of people chasing the same dream, all competing for the same auditions, the same opportunities, and the same tiny chance that somebody important might notice them. At the time, there was very little reason to believe Danny would become one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood. He did not fit the traditional image of a leading man. He was shorter than almost everyone around him, had a distinctive appearance, and constantly found himself competing in an industry that rewarded a very specific type of actor. Audition after audition ended the same way. Casting directors would thank him for coming in, offer polite encouragement, and then move on to somebody else. Many actors would have interpreted those years as a sign to quit. Danny never did. Part of that determination came from necessity. He loved acting too much to imagine doing anything else. Another part came from his belief that success meant finding people who appreciated what made you different rather than trying to become somebody else. That philosophy would end up shaping his entire life. In January of 1971, a young actress named Rhea Perlman attended an off-Broadway production called The Shrinking Bride. She was not there to discover Danny DeVito. She was there to watch a friend perform. But by the end of the night, the person she could not stop thinking about was Danny. Years later, Rhea would openly admit that she made the first move. She was fascinated by him almost immediately, not because he looked like a movie star, but because he possessed something much more interesting: confidence, humor, presence. He seemed completely comfortable being himself in a world where most people were desperately trying to be somebody else. After the show ended, she found a way to meet him. Both of them came from working-class families. Both were trying to establish themselves as actors. Both understood what it felt like to chase a future that was far from guaranteed. They spoke for hours and quickly realized they viewed the world in remarkably similar ways. Within weeks, Rhea had moved into Danny's apartment. To outsiders, it probably looked reckless. Most people spend months or years getting to know one another before making that kind of commitment. Danny and Rhea seemed to operate on instinct. They trusted what they felt and decided not to overcomplicate it. What neither of them knew was that they were building a partnership that would outlast countless Hollywood marriages, survive enormous success, endure separation, and continue long after most couples would have given up. The rise nobody expected. When Danny and Rhea first met, neither one was famous. Both were still trying to establish careers. Both were still waiting for the break that could change everything. For Danny, that opportunity arrived gradually rather than overnight. Throughout the early 1970s, he worked steadily but remained largely unknown to the general public. The major turning point came when his friendship with Michael Douglas led to a role in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The film became a phenomenon. It won Academy Awards, earned critical acclaim, and introduced Danny to a much larger audience. Suddenly, people in Hollywood began paying attention to the actor many had overlooked for years. Yet even then, his biggest breakthrough was still ahead of him. That breakthrough arrived in 1978 with Taxi. The role of Louis De Palma transformed Danny's career. The loud, abrasive dispatcher became one of television's most memorable characters, and audiences immediately embraced him. What made the performance so effective was Danny's willingness to fully commit to the role. Louis was selfish, rude, manipulative, and often completely ridiculous. Somehow, Danny made him impossible to ignore. The success of Taxi changed his life. For the first time, he had financial security. For the first time, he had genuine influence in Hollywood. For the first time, the industry that had spent years rejecting him suddenly wanted more. Throughout all of it, Rhea remained by his side. She understood something many people around Danny did not. She knew exactly who he had been before the fame arrived. She remembered the auditions, the uncertainty, the small apartments, and the years when success seemed far away. That perspective mattered. Hollywood has a way of changing relationships. Fame introduces money, pressure, attention, and temptation. Many couples struggle to survive those changes because they build their relationship around success instead of building it before success arrives. Danny and Rhea had already experienced the difficult years together. The foundation was already there. Ironically, Rhea's own breakthrough was about to arrive as well. When she was cast as Carla Tortelli on Cheers, she became one of the most beloved characters on television. Audiences loved her sharp wit, quick comebacks, and fearless personality. The role earned her multiple Emmy Awards and turned her into a star in her own right. What made their relationship unusual was that neither person lived in the other's shadow. Danny became successful. Rhea became successful. Neither achievement threatened the other. Instead, they seemed to enjoy watching each other win. By the early 1980s, they had become one of Hollywood's most admired couples. They married, started a family, and appeared to have built the kind of life many people only dream about. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The reality, as they would eventually discover, was far more complicated. The life they built together. As Danny and Rhea entered the 1980s, they found themselves in a position few actors ever reach. Both had successful television careers. Both were earning critical acclaim. Both had become recognizable faces across America. Yet what made their story unusual was not the fame they accumulated. It was the life they built around it. Hollywood relationships often struggle because careers become competitions. One person's success can create insecurity in the other. Resentments grow. Priorities shift. Before long, the relationship that once felt solid begins to crack under the weight of ambition. Danny and Rhea seemed immune to that problem. If anything, they appeared genuinely excited by each other's achievements. When Danny landed major film roles, Rhea celebrated them. When Rhea earned award nominations for Cheers, Danny spoke about her success with obvious pride. There was no sense that one person's accomplishments diminished the others. That attitude became even more important once they started raising children. Lucy arrived first, followed by Grace and then Jacob. Suddenly, life became about much more than acting jobs and television ratings. They were building a family while simultaneously navigating two demanding careers. It was not always easy. Television schedules were exhausting. Film productions could take actors away from home for weeks or months at a time. Interviews, promotional appearances, and industry events filled whatever free time remained. Yet friends who knew the couple often remarked on how committed they were to maintaining a normal family life despite their increasingly unusual circumstances. One reason may have been that both Danny and Rhea remembered what life looked like before success arrived. Neither had grown up wealthy. Neither viewed fame as something that automatically solved life's problems. They appreciated what they had, but they did not confuse professional success with personal happiness. During this period, Danny's career continued to expand. Movies such as Romancing the Stone, Throw Mama from the Train, Twins, and Batman Returns turned him into one of the most recognizable character actors in the world. Audiences loved his ability to move effortlessly between comedy and drama. One moment he could make people laugh, and the next, he could play someone genuinely intimidating. At the same time, Rhea remained a fixture on one of television's biggest shows. Together, they became something increasingly rare in Hollywood, a long-term success story. But there was another side to their relationship that often received less attention. They were not simply actors. They were business partners. In the early 1980s, they helped establish Jersey Films, a production company that would eventually become responsible for some of the most influential films of its era. Through that company, they played a role in projects such as Pulp Fiction, Erin Brockovich, Garden State, and several others. The success of Jersey Films revealed something important about their relationship. Danny and Rhea were not just husband and wife. They were collaborators. They enjoyed building things together. Whether it was raising children, producing films, or supporting each other's careers, they seemed to function best when working toward a shared goal. For decades, that formula worked remarkably well. Then, slowly, something began to change. The problem nobody saw coming. When people look back at celebrity relationships, they often search for a dramatic turning point, a scandal, an affair, a public argument, something obvious that explains why two people drifted apart. Life is rarely that simple. The same qualities that once brought two people together can eventually pull them in different directions. By the time Danny and Rhea reached their later years together, they had already spent decades building a life side by side. Their children were growing older. Their careers had entered new phases. The constant struggle that defined their younger years had largely disappeared. Ironically, stability sometimes creates its own challenges. When people spend years fighting toward a common goal, the struggle itself can keep them connected. Once those goals are achieved, they are forced to ask a different question. Rhea would later speak carefully about this period of their lives. She never seemed interested in assigning blame or turning private matters into public entertainment. But she acknowledged that maintaining a relationship for decades is complicated. The version of yourself that enters a relationship in your 20s is rarely the same version that reaches your 60s or 70s. For Danny and Rhea, those changes eventually became impossible to ignore. In 2012, after more than 30 years of marriage and more than 40 years together overall, they announced their separation. Many fans were shocked. Hollywood had conditioned people to expect celebrity marriages to collapse after a few years. Danny and Rhea seemed different. They had survived pressures that destroyed countless other relationships. If they could not make it work forever, who could? Yet what happened next was even more surprising, because unlike most celebrity separations, this one did not become a war. There were no public attacks, no ugly interviews, no attempts to embarrass one another. Instead, both seemed determined to handle the situation with dignity. That decision would ultimately redefine what their relationship became. Most couples who separate spend the following years trying to untangle their lives. Danny and Rhea seem to spend those years finding a new way to stay connected. And that may be the most remarkable part of their entire story. The relationship that refused to end. For many couples, separation represents the final chapter. For Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman, it became the beginning of an entirely different kind of relationship. The first few months were not easy. Both have acknowledged that the transition was difficult. After spending decades together, adjusting to separate lives required time and patience. Yet even during the hardest moments, neither seemed interested in erasing the other from their life. That distinction ended up making all the difference. Many relationships collapse because the people involved stop communicating. Hurt feelings turn into silence. Silence turns into distance. Eventually, two people who once knew everything about each other become strangers. Danny and Rhea never allowed that process to happen. They continued speaking regularly. They continued attending family events. They continued showing up for birthdays, holidays, and important milestones. Most importantly, they continued viewing themselves as part of the same family. Their children often found themselves in a situation that is almost unheard of after a celebrity separation. They did not have to choose sides. There was no public conflict forcing everyone into opposing camps. Danny and Rhea remained united when it came to the people they loved most. Over time, something unusual happened. The public slowly stopped viewing their separation as a failure. Instead, many people began seeing it as evidence that relationships can evolve without completely ending. That idea became even more apparent in interviews. Whenever Danny was asked about Rhea, there was no bitterness in his answers. He spoke about her with affection and respect. The same was true when Rhea discussed Danny. Even when acknowledging the difficulties they had faced, she never seemed interested in rewriting history or pretending their decades together had been anything other than meaningful. In a culture obsessed with dramatic breakups and public feuds, their approach felt refreshingly mature. Neither person was trying to win. They were simply trying to preserve something valuable. That perspective became increasingly important as they entered the later stages of their lives. By then, they had grandchildren. They had decades of memories. They had a family history too significant to throw away because a marriage had changed form. And perhaps that is the insight most people miss when discussing Danny and Rhea. Many assume the goal of every relationship is permanence in a traditional sense. If two people stop living together, the relationship must have failed. If a marriage changes, the love must have disappeared. Danny and Rhea's story suggests something different. Sometimes relationships survive by becoming something new. The love story Hollywood never understood. One of the reasons Danny and Rhea's story continues to fascinate people is because it refuses to fit neatly into familiar categories. They are not the classic Hollywood success story. They are not the classic Hollywood tragedy either. If anything, they exist somewhere in between. Their relationship contains elements of both. They experienced extraordinary success together. They raised a family. They built careers. They created a partnership that lasted longer than most people thought possible. At the same time, they eventually reached a point where living together no longer worked. For many observers, those realities seem contradictory. How can two people separate and still care so deeply about one another? How can a marriage change while the emotional bond remains intact? The answer may be simpler than people expect. Love and compatibility are not always the same thing. Two people can genuinely care about each other while recognizing that certain aspects of their relationship no longer function the way they once did. The mature response is not always to force things back to the way they were. Sometimes it is to find a new arrangement that allows both people to thrive. That appears to be exactly what Danny and Rhea did. Neither one seems interested in pretending the separation never happened. At the same time, neither one behaves as though the relationship ended. Instead, they have spent years maintaining what matters while letting go of what no longer worked. That approach requires a level of trust many couples never achieve. It also requires perspective. When you have known someone for more than 50 years, your connection extends far beyond romance. That person becomes part of your personal history. They witness your successes, your failures, your fears, and your growth. They know versions of you that nobody else remembers. Replacing that kind of bond is nearly impossible. Danny and Rhea seem to understand that. Rather than treating each other as former spouses, they behave more like lifelong companions whose relationship simply evolved into something different. That may not be the traditional ending people expect. It may, however, be the more honest one. At 81 years old, Danny DeVito has lived several different lives. He was the struggling actor sleeping in tiny apartments and wondering whether his big break would ever arrive. He was the television star who became one of the most recognizable faces in America. He was the movie actor who built a career playing unforgettable characters. He was a producer, a director, a father, and eventually a grandfather. Over the course of more than 6 decades in entertainment, he earned the kind of success that most people only dream about. Yet, when you look back across the story of his life, the most important chapter is not a movie, a television show, or an award. It is a relationship. Long before Hollywood accepted Danny DeVito, Rhea Perlman already had. She met him when he was still fighting for opportunities, still trying to prove himself, and still years away from becoming a household name. She saw something in him before the rest of the world did, and in many ways, that became the foundation for everything that followed. Together, they built a family, raised 3 children, navigated extraordinary careers, and spent more than half a century sharing a life that survived pressures most relationships never have to face. What makes their story so fascinating is that it refuses to fit neatly into the categories people expect. It is not the story of a perfect marriage, because they eventually separated. It is not the story of a bitter breakup, because they never stopped caring about one another. It is not even a traditional Hollywood love story, because Hollywood love stories usually end with one person becoming a footnote in the other's life. That never happened here. Instead, Danny and Rhea created something far more unusual. They found a way to remain connected even after the relationship changed. They continued showing up for birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, and all of the moments that mattered most. They continued talking, continued supporting one another, and continued sharing a bond that neither time nor distance seemed capable of erasing. Perhaps that is why their story resonates with so many people. Most of us have been taught to think about relationships in very simple terms. Either they last forever, or they fail. Either people stay together, or they move on. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman challenge that idea entirely. Their story suggests that relationships can evolve without disappearing, that love can take different forms over time, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones that refuse to follow conventional rules. After more than 5 decades, Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman's story still refuses to fit the Hollywood script. Whatever happened between them, the bond they built proved stronger than most people ever expected. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other celebrity stories.